I think that we actually need a political solution and an economic approach. And the political solution is at hand because all the world agrees to it, other than two countries. The political solution is that there should be a state of Palestine, and it should live alongside the state of Israel. And Israel should not be able to veto a state of Palestine. And we're actually quite close to that, except the US keeps vetoing it on behalf of Israel. If the US would actually be sensible and say this is what international law, international agreements, and the only way for a global consensus that exists to resolve this crisis is, we would actually get there quite quickly. The US alone vetoed the state of Palestine as the 194th UN member state. What's ironic, and I speak to diplomats in the Arab region all the time, and in the Arab and Islamic countries all the time, they're ready for peace, peace with Israel, peace, normalization of relations. They don't want war in the region. The Saudis don't want war. UAE doesn't want war. Egypt doesn't want war. Jordan doesn't want war. Lebanon doesn't want war. But they want Palestine not to live under apartheid rule, or worse, under a genocide, which is what's happening in Gaza right now. So I think the politics is actually straightforward, except that it's blocked by the United States. And I'm hoping that America wakes up to the very obvious point that the American people want Palestine to have political rights, and the world community is united for that, and that all the United States is doing is perpetuating war and promoting its own complete isolation, and I would say fundamentally endangering Israel as a viable state, because Israel needs some legitimacy, not just to be seen as a war crime state protected by the United States. That's a bad bargain for all concerned. When it comes to the economics, I couldn't agree more that there's ample opportunity for regional development, and there is a water crisis, and desalination is the way forward, and there are so many things that could be done. One needs peace. Now, the reason why we have to combine the political and the economic is that one of the gambits of Trump and Biden was, oh, we could kind of bribe them. They don't really need a state. All we need is some economic terms. But the truth of the matter is, Israel right now is absolutely radicalized extremist compared to what it was even a quarter century ago, much less in the 1970s. It's an extremist government. It is saying overtly among the major cabinet members, this is our land. We will never allow a state of Palestine. We will dominate the land, and so forth, including the so-called occupied territories, which is Palestine, but they call Judea and Samaria. It's really dangerous how extremist Israel has become. And so I think we need to say, as a world community, stop the extremism. We need a political settlement, clear 1967 borders, a state of Palestine, capital in East Jerusalem, and we need an economic framework that can go along with that. And I think both are possible.
With the Peace of Westphalia approach, where you acknowledge that you have to forgive the crimes of the other side, which both are so adamant in insisting upon. In your interview with Robert, you brought up the encyclical of Pope Francis, in which he spoke about the meeting of St. Francis with the Sultan Malik al-Kamil of Egypt on the battlefield of the Fifth Crusade. I found that absolutely fascinating.
It is a great story, a
Um,
true one.
yeah,
Amazing.
right. So Pope Francis's encyclical, which I looked up, it's called Fratelli Tutti, which means all brothers, which of course reminds you quickly of the Friedrich Schiller phrase "Alle Menschen werden Brüder," from the which all
Exactly.
mankind will be brothers, which Beethoven said in his Ninth Symphony. What can you tell us about this meeting of St. Francis and the Sultan?
Well, this was the Fifth Crusade, and St. Francis was saintly. He believed in peace, and he believed that there would be a way to reconcile the Christian and the Muslim world. So he trekked on foot from his native Assisi to the battlefield in Egypt in 1219 and met with Sultan al-Malik. And he had an all-nighter with with the Sultan in a discussion, a debate about religion, politics, and war. It is a meeting that went down in history as a peace seeker. It did not end the Fifth Crusade. St. Francis left without peace, but he did have that conversation. And Pope Francis raised this at the beginning of this wonderful encyclical because he said that it not only is inspiring that his namesake, St. Francis, made this journey, but also because he and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, which is the great, great center of learning of the last 1,000 years in Cairo, in Egypt, the great Muslim center of learning, the Pope and the Grand Imam have really joined hands in calling for peace and saying there is a way forward, but you have to reach across the divide, like St. Francis did in 1219. So that's the message of the encyclical. It's a wonderful encyclical. It's really Pope Francis's great wisdom as a great pastoral leader. He's basically explaining, how do you deal with the other side? Do you deal with hate, propaganda, war making, or do you find a way to have what he calls encounter, and that is to meet the other side? So in addition to the meeting of St. Francis and the Sultan, a lot of the encyclical is taken up with the parable of the Great Samaritan told by Jesus, where you have a Samaritan robbed and left bloodied on the side of the road, and many pious people walk by him, Jews in the community, but it's a Samaritan, meaning someone from actually another jurisdiction and a religious group that the Jews looked down on at the time of Jesus's parable. And it's the Samaritan who rescues the robbed person, brings him to an inn, gives money for his care, and the Pope says, this is the way that the world can be saved, and the only way the world can be saved. And I find it an extraordinarily important encyclical, very basic in its intention, which is don't shout hate to the other side. Find the way to have a dialogue with the other side. It's so simple and so basic and so far from what we do right now. For me, the telltale fact of the recklessness and foolishness of Washington is that Biden has not tried to speak with Putin one time since the end of 2021. With all the war going on, the risk of nuclear war, the disasters, Biden doesn't even understand that there's a role for for speaking. And why do I say Biden? Because President Putin actually said repeatedly, I'm open for discussion, but they don't want to talk. And the truth is, I've been watching this very close up because I know all these people. The US does not have the idea of diplomacy. They don't get it. They don't know it. We have a Secretary of State, but we don't have a diplomat.
Right. On the question of the Vatican's role in this situation, in addition to the encyclical which you just described, you're also a member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences at the Vatican. I'm afraid I don't really know exactly what that is, but I'm wondering what you and others in that and in others that you're in touch with in the Vatican, what is being done to try to realize the Pope's offer from a few years ago now to use the Vatican as a forum for peace negotiations.
Well, the Pope has reiterated this just recently. He said that Ukraine should show the bravery to open to negotiations. Actually, in Ukraine, there's a law that Zelensky pushed, which says that it's illegal to negotiate with Russia until Russia leaves Ukraine. In other words, we can't have negotiations to end this war.
Yeah.
The war magically has to end first. Well, this is completely backwards, completely destructive, but it has meant that Ukraine rejects negotiations, and the United States, which is very poorly led by President Biden, takes the line, which I think is both a dodge and a delusion. Well, we can't do anything unless the Ukrainians ask for it, and since the Ukrainians don't want negotiation, we say no to negotiations. This is a complete cop-out. Actually, it's almost the opposite of the truth. The U.S. has pushed this war all along. The U.S. has funded this war. The U.S. has armed Ukraine. It's the U.S., by the way, that told Ukraine, keep fighting, when Ukraine was ready to settle on the basis of neutrality in March 2022. And then the US and UK came in and said, no, we arm you, you keep fighting. And that is about 500,000 deaths earlier that would have been averted, but for the US insistence, I would say, that its client state keep fighting. And so all of this has meant that while the Pope has said repeatedly, the Vatican stands ready to use the Pope's good offices, to use the Vatican, to use our ability to have outreach to Patriarch Kirill and other religious leaders. It's been blocked by the geopolitics up until now.
Right. Now, in terms of the U.S. as the unipolar power of the world, nearly the entire global South is now quite verbally and publicly and openly rejecting the whole policy of colonialism. Really, the 500 years and plus of human history has been largely defined by this colonial era. But they're now being offered something quite different from the BRICS, from the Belt and Road, something different than the austerity and subservience that the IMF and the World Bank policies and the colonial powers have imposed all these centuries. So what do you think about the Belt and Road and the BRICS policies in terms of dealing with the continuing immiseration of much of the developing sector, so-called third world, as we used to call it?
Well, the U.S. really has starkly divided the world because the U.S. has said you're with us or you're against us. And it said that repeatedly. It said that with regard to the Iraq War in 2023 and onward, and it says it now with regard to Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia. You're either with us applying these sanctions or you're against us. Most of the world doesn't want to be for or against. It wants to be left alone. Most of the world is trying to get on with living, trying to get on with facing many, many challenges and crises, and it doesn't want to be told by the United States, you do what we say, or we somehow punish you or put on sanctions and so on. So we're in the midst of that upheaval right now. Europe, to my disappointment, which has the capacity to be an independent actor, has for the moment fallen almost entirely into the US camp. And countries that should know better, and a European Union that should know better, acts almost as if it's simply a complete dependency on the US. And the European Union no longer distinguishes between the EU, which is an economic and political union, and NATO, which is a US-led military alliance. And it's a shame, but true, that the capital of the EU and the capital of NATO are both in Brussels, in the same city, and effectively the same thing right now. So when the world divides, you have the US and Europe and a few allies in Asia, important countries, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, effectively in that group. And then you have most of the rest of the world, not per se against the US, but saying, stop it. Stop dividing the world. Stop creating Cold Wars. Stop your military expansionism. Stop your regime change operations and all the rest. Just get along. And that's the vast majority of the world. I would say 150 countries or so. There are 27 in the European Union, plus the United States, plus the handful of non-EU countries, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, coming up to probably about 40 countries in the, quote, US camp. It's a dangerous, sad, ridiculous way to behave, that we're number one, and if we can't be number one for everybody, we'll be number one in our group among the 40 or so, and we'll divide the world. It's a lousy bargain for Americans. It's a lousy bargain for the world. It's pretty much where we are right now. Now, when you look at any other individual developing country, generally their position is, I'd like to trade with the US, I'd like to trade with Europe, I'd like to trade with Russia, I'd like to trade with China. Why should I choose? I just want to get along. I don't need to take sides. But it's the US that is forcing this sharp division. And it's a shame, and it's a huge mistake for the US, because when countries are forced to choose, they say, okay, we'll go with the other side, because it looks like a better bargain. And when you ask specifically about what's on offer, one of the things that's on offer right now is this Belt and Road Initiative, which is a $1 trillion plus initiative of China to finance modern infrastructure in partner countries. Fast rail, this is a huge part of Belt and Road. Many places are getting rail service for effectively the first time, or the first time in modern technology, such as a rail line that I actually was near to just recently in Ethiopia, running from Addis Ababa to the port in Djibouti. Many countries are getting major power systems, hydroelectric dams, and so on. And so the Belt and Road Initiative is a tremendous initiative. Naturally, the United States badmouths it, says it's awful, it's terrible, because the United States can't say anything good about China, because China is an affront to the American arrogant claim of superiority. And so everything the US says about China is bad mouthing. It's basically lies, fibs, misrepresentations, and misunderstandings, because what China's doing is very constructive in the world. And so this is why so many other countries are saying, okay, you force me to choose, I choose the Belt and Road.
Right. Well, finally, there's some revolt going on in the United States. I mean, we now have hundreds of universities in upheaval. Students are protesting the war policies of our government. They're spurred on, obviously, by the genocide in Gaza, but it really goes beyond that. The response of both parties and most of the Congress has been send in the police, and perhaps soon the National Guard. People may recall that it was exactly 54 years ago in May of 1970 that the National Guard opened fire on peaceful demonstrators at Kent State University in Ohio, killing 4 and wounding 9. Are we seeing this coming again?
Well, we're seeing a kind of panic by the politicians and by the university administrators to what the students are saying. What the students are saying is they don't like genocide. They don't support what Israel is doing. They want it to stop. And the students are absolutely correct in this. This is a shock to the politicians who are, of course, deeply influenced, one could say bought off by the Israel lobby, by the big money that entails, or by the military-industrial complex, and frankly are shocked and amazed that there's such a strong sentiment among America's young people pro-Palestinian. I don't think the political class expected this at all. But then again, what Israel is doing is so vulgar, so cruel, so crass. It's not really surprising. But this caught the politicians and the university administrators completely off guard. And remember that many of these universities have large donors, Jewish donors and other donors, very pro-Israel, very pro-military industrial complex. And these donors immediately said, what are these students doing? How dare they do this? And so the administrators at Columbia panicked, behaved very incorrectly, in a very peremptory way, suddenly started outlawing student organizations, cracking down on students for being on Zoom calls, and couldn't stomach that there were overt demonstrations on the campus against Israel's war in Gaza. Of course there would be. And so what? It's a protest. So let it be. But the university said, oh, this is terrible. This is anti-Semitism. This is a danger. Everything was exaggerated in a kind of panic. And the universities wanted to prove to the Congress, oh, we're going to take care of this anti-Israel sentiment. This is absolutely terrible. And so they cracked down. They called the police across the United States. Students, faculty arrested, students expelled. Again, if they had read Pope Francis's encyclical and actually talked to the students, they would have gotten somewhere. The president of Harvard, it seems, from what I know, and I know him actually very, very well, and I think he's done a good job, he spoke to the students. He discussed with them. They said, okay, you've made some promises. You're going to take up the issues of the university's divestment policies. We're going to have more learning about what's happened in the Middle East and so on. And they peacefully decamped. Whereas at Columbia, the police came in twice. Very brutal and absolutely unnecessary. But that happened all across the country because the university administrators, by and large, wanted to show these right-wingers. It's not even right-wingers. They wanted, it's actually, I scratched the phrase.
Yeah,
They
right.
wanted to show both parties of Congress, we're absolutely, we understand what free speech is, which means don't allow it if it's against the prevailing policy of the United States, which is to support Israel at any cost and at all costs. And so they fell all over each other to impress the politicians. The politicians did their usual demagoguery, and they came to the campuses and they called the pro-Palestinian protesters anti-Semitic and every kind of slur and slander you can imagine. And this is where we are in America. We do not speak with each other in a civilized way.
Right. Do you know Professor Bruce Robbins at Columbia?
No.
Do you know the name? No. He's a professor of English and English literature. But he just I sent you this morning actually a 6-minute video that he released. He went to he describes, I went to the encampment, I talked to them, they're all peaceful, that's what they want is peace. They want to make their point about the genocide, about the evil that's taking place. And what's the response? The response is the police came in. And then he said that he began to see something was amiss when after the October 6th events, Columbia set up a 3-person team to investigate anti-Semitism. And he said all 3 of the people that were chosen were Zionists, and that their report just completely ignored, 100% ignored what was going on in Gaza. And all they talked about was the evil of Hamas and so forth. It's a very interesting video.
Yeah, I didn't see it, but it completely comports with everything that I've spoken with my colleagues at length in recent weeks. And I think the actions that were taken by our administrators and similar actions taken by administrators of universities and other places was wrong, completely contrary to the spirit of the university, completely contrary to the First Amendment rights of free speech and the right to protest, and completely neglectful of the ground reality, which is that Israel is killing tens of thousands of people. And I'm proud that our students are saying, no, don't do that. That's what students should be saying.
You said something similar in your interview with Judge Napolitano, which I took note of, which is that the U.S. wants to maintain its hegemony around the world, but to do so, it's imposing internal suppression on the U.S. population, and that this was, your term was that it was breaking apart our community, undermining the role of universities as places of debate, speaking out on ideas, and instead is bringing in the police to crush peaceful opposition. So that's what you've just explained in a bit, I guess.
The American people do not want or need in any way hegemony for our safety, our security, or our well-being. China is not an enemy. Russia is not an enemy. We don't need these wars. They don't make us safer. They don't make us more prosperous. And the American people sense it or know it, and they oppose the foreign policy. And of course, in the US at this point, almost all foreign policy is managed secretly, really by a small group. Everything is under classified control. What is told to us are lies, and the public is protesting. And in order to keep to the lies, the government is cracking down. That's where we are. It's extremely dangerous.
What else do you think is going on amongst the faculty at Columbia and perhaps other universities that I'm sure you're in touch with as well? What do you think they are doing about this, and what do you think they can do about it? I can imagine that the presidents Hillary Clinton and Victoria Nuland becoming professors at Columbia is not going to help very much. The president of the university, Minosh Shaflik, was the first university president to call in the police, and she shut down the student protests. She's also a member of the House. I don't know if you know her background, but she's also a member of the House of Lords in the UK. She was vice president of the World Bank and a managing director at the IMF and a deputy director at the Bank of England. So we're dealing here with a person at the very center of the global financial oligarchy. And now she's running a leading university like Columbia. What do you think of that?
Well, I think the main point is her community is the students and the faculty. And I would say to her and I have said to her and to the administration, pay attention to your community. The outsiders who are aiming to divide us, the politicians who are always ready for their bit of demagoguery, even the donors, okay, they may be generous, but they cannot run an academic community and should not. And everybody should know that, including them, including the donors themselves. Pay attention to your community, because if the community breaks, what do you have? What's left? And so I think that this is really the point. The faculty are very unhappy, at least hundreds of them are. There is a faculty vote of no confidence underway right now. It's a several-day online system of voting, so I don't know how it's going or what the outcome is, but the fact of it is a demonstration that a significant fraction of the Columbia faculty is really unhappy with how things have happened, and I know faculty is very concerned about the students who were expelled, suspended for doing the right thing, protesting injustice, and exercising their critical faculties, their thinking, and their First Amendment rights. And they should not be suspended for that or expelled, much less.
The universities are beginning to shut down now at the end of the term and the summer break. And these protests may not continue, but in your view, what would it take to rally the national sentiment of the students that are already expressing their concerns, but the rest of the population as well, to rally them against these wars with something like a March on Washington or some major display of the kind of what you said? The U.S. people don't agree with these wars. How do we galvanize that?
Well, I think it's likely to continue. I don't think that even with the school year ending, the protests are going to stop. We're in an election year also. There are going to be lots of gatherings of people. There will be political conventions. There will be campaign events. Which seems tragically likely, but if the fighting in Gaza continues the way it's going right now, with more senseless deaths and more violence, I'm pretty sure that the protests are going to continue to play a very big role in American society in the coming weeks.
Do you have any recommendations on how to consolidate that or to expand on it?
I don't have recommendations. I'm trying on my part to move forward the diplomacy. My particular area of effort right now is to try to apply the maximum logic and geopolitical sense for the U.S. to drop its veto on the state of Palestine, because I really believe if we could have a state of Palestine in the UN, so much of the rest of making peace would follow very quickly.
Yeah, right. Well, as you certainly know, there were tens of thousands of Israelis who've been out in the streets over the last few weeks, generally demanding an end of the war and a release of the hostages. And Bibi, of course, has insisted that the planned slaughter, and now it appears the ongoing slaughter of innocents in Rafah, is going to proceed with or without a deal with Hamas. Do you see any hope that the Israelis themselves can end the madness of Bibi and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, so forth?
I'm not so optimistic. I'm not so close to it, but this group is ruthless. This is obvious with so many tens of thousands dead, with this senseless and absolutely brutal military campaign underway. This is a ruthless group, and the demonstrations are not exactly for peace. They're for release of the hostages. They are anti-Bibi to an important extent, but unfortunately, there's a lot of feeling across Israeli society, according to the opinion surveys, for very harsh continued measures in Gaza. And I think that is very concerning. I'm not sure that the peace is going to come from within Israel. I think it's more likely to come from the international community, which, again, putting aside the U.S. veto, is pretty much unanimous in rejecting what Israel is doing.
Right.
I'm afraid I'm at the top of the hour, so I'm going to have to stop because I have a call this moment. If you want
one what?
If you wanted one more, that would be fine.
Well,
but
I'll ask you to close by saying what you can about China. You know China very well. You spend time there. We've already discussed the fact that the NATO people want a global NATO and a war on China. What do you think we should do about this?
Well, since China's a rather big 1.4 billion people and with a huge and I think very constructive role to play in the world, I hope we could have another discussion about that at length. So I don't want to oversimplify, but I will say basically one sentence. China is not our enemy. This is the most important point to understand. China is not out to run the world. It's not out to dominate the United States. It's not out to invade the US. It's not out to hinder the United States. The idea of China as the enemy is a US concoction. It's a resentment of China being large and successful. It is not a measure of China per se. And this is the most important thing for Americans to understand. Stop making enemies where they don't exist. If one persists long enough in calling someone else an enemy and acting that way, you'll create an enemy. But if you have more sense and understand that China is not our enemy, we have no reason to make China an enemy, nor will it be an enemy.